One day, a man suffered a severe heart attack. All of his buddies at work were worried about him. But sure enough, after about a week, much to the surprise of his coworkers, he was back in the office. They all asked him, "How did you recover?" He said, "I had another heart attack." Today, anyone calling for a Keynesian recovery is only calling for more of the disorder that led us into the present world financial breakdown crisis. But even more, anyone today who proudly calls himself or herself a Keynesian is really only confessing that they are a fascist, witting or unwitting. The roots of today's economic crisis began immediately after the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had made his intentions for the post-war world absolutely clear. That after entering a very difficult alliance with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and winning the war against fascism, Roosevelt was determined to put an end to British colonialism and the British financial empire. In a February 12th address to the U.S. Congress in 1945, Roosevelt requested the passage of the Bretton Woods provisions agreed upon at the conference that past summer. FDR declared that the courage America demonstrated in winning the war must be put toward winning a lasting peace, which meant transforming the vast U.S. wartime economy and employment to help developing nations and nations racked by war to build up their own powers as sovereign governments, determine their own economic destiny. This required a system of finance, a world credit system at fixed exchange rates to ensure stability in long-term investments and a consistent flow of funds to nations for productive enterprises. This credit system, with the strong U.S. dollar as the reserve, was the American proposal at the Bretton Woods Conference to secure the financial affairs between nations and create the post-war institutions to best accomplish mutual economic growth and a lasting peace. However, as we see today, Roosevelt's proposal was not the one that was implemented. Instead, a Keynesian system, a British monetarist credit system, a British central banking system which became the post-FDR IMF and World Bank was put in place. Now for the fools who are howling for a Keynesian recovery for today's crisis and the creation of a super central banking mechanism to draw money out of governments to bail out a failed and bankrupt world financial system, we at LaRouche urge you not to shoot yourself in the head to save your foot. But let's preface our story with John Maynard Keynes himself. In 1937, Keynes released an edition of the General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in German, as he anticipated it would be better received under Germany's new leadership. In the preface to the German edition, Keynes admitted that, quote, "Much in the following book was written and illustrated in reference to the situation in Anglo-Saxon countries. Nevertheless, the theory of production as a whole, which is the object of this book, can be much better adapted to the conditions of a totalitarian state than the theory of production and distribution of wealth under circumstances of free competition and a large measure of laissez-faire." End quote. I wonder if that's what the Keynesians mean when they say big government. In 1930, the Bank for International Settlements was set up ostensibly to guarantee German reparation payments to the Allies, and according to its charter, it was to be immune from seizures, closure, or censure, regardless of whether the bank directors were involved in war. Just business. The BIS was jointly established by the governor of the Bank of England, Montagu Norman, and his close ally and later Hitler's finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht. At that time, Montagu Norman was also involved with his partners on Wall Street, including the grandfather of former Bush League President George W. Bush Jr., funneling money back into Germany to the Nazi Party. On the eve of Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, the Czech leadership transported their national gold reserves out of the country to the Bank for International Settlements to be kept safe in London. But when the Nazis took the country and demanded the reserves, the British and the BIS returned the gold and put it right into the hands of Hitler. The Nazi military invasions continued across the European continent, but they needed some place to store the war loot, the gold seized from the national banks of Austria, Belgium, and Czechoslovakia, or the Reichsbank's holdings, the wedding rings, lighters, and gold fillings. Conveniently, the officials directing the BIS included two appointees of Adolf Hitler himself, Walter Funk and Emil Pohl, as well as Hermann Schmitz, the director of both IG Farben and the Auschwitz concentration camp, and Baron Kurt von Schroeder, owner of the J.H. Stein Bank, which held the deposits of the Gestapo. Such was the Bank for International Settlements, and with this makeup, it continued in operation throughout the war and after. During the Bretton Woods Conference in July of 1944, a fight broke out between the American delegation of the Roosevelt Loyalists, Harry Dexter White and Henry Morgenthau, against the British Imperial delegation and their lead representative, John Maynard Keynes, over whether or not to shut down the Bank for International Settlements, whose operations were well known. On July 10th, at the conference, a resolution was drawn up to dissolve the Bank for International Settlements at the earliest possible moment. Fighting against the bank's dissolution on the British Empire side was the Dutch delegation, J. W. Bain of Holland, and U.S. defectors from Wall Street, including representatives for the Chase Bank and the First National Bank of New York, and Dean Acheson, a representative from the State Department who was part of the American Liberty League's early attempts to destroy the Roosevelt administration from within. This imperialist group vetoed the resolution which called for opening the books and records of the BIS to investigate just what exactly their activities were during the war. During the fray, Keynes stepped up to announce the official opposition of the British delegation. He called to postpone the dissolution of the BIS until after the war, and according to an account given by Harry Dexter White, Keynes argued to table any discussion of looted gold. In the following days, from July 18th to the 19th, the American delegation met amongst themselves. The debate broke down along the lines of the Wall Street interest and the FDR loyalists, with Wall Street concocting absurd arguments that American shareholders would lose investments in the BIS, so we had better keep the Nazi piggy bank intact. The real Americans argued that the only reason they would keep it open is that they shared interests with the Germans, and their argument carried the most weight. When Dean Acheson found out that his faction was going to lose, he cried to the British delegation. On July 20th, Acheson interrupted Keynes in the middle of a British summit meeting and said he was concerned that the Roosevelt faction would have the BIS dissolved too soon. This meant that the Nazi loot would be seized and the books would be opened, revealing just how London and Wall Street bankrolled the most destructive imperial war machine of the 20th century. Keynes, in a panic, left the conference, and with the elevator packed with conference members, rushed up 3 flights of stairs and knocked on Henry Morgenthau's door. Keynes stood there, trembling, red-faced, and sweating with rage. He tried to collect himself and said as calmly as he could that the dissolution of the BIS should be postponed. Morgenthau would not budge, and throughout the night, Keynes sent pleading messages to the American. The next day, the dissolution of the BIS was debated openly, and its disposal was approved. Of course, the Wall Street and British Imperial faction didn't give up. The dissolution of the bank was held off just long enough, and on April 12, 1945, Roosevelt was out of the picture. Harry S. Truman was sworn in as president and sided with Keynes and his faction. The Bank for International Settlements was never dissolved as planned, and its books remained highly classified. Roosevelt's vision for the post-war institutions set up at the Bretton Woods Conference were sabotaged by Truman, and the system implemented instead was Keynesian, in the clothing of a fixed exchange rate system, but a monetary system centered in Britain. Truman immediately took steps in cooperation with London to reinforce colonialism as in Indochina. And what has happened since that time is that the United States moved away from Roosevelt's post-war intention, and the empire, the international monetary system centered in Britain, took over more and more. That system is dead and gone, and those who wish to hold on to Keynesian fantasies are only guaranteeing civilization a road towards a new international dark age. The U.S. government, in cooperation with Russia, China, and India, must now establish a new Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate credit system as defined by Lyndon LaRouche and as intended by President Roosevelt. The entire bankrupt world system must be placed under bankruptcy reorganization, and with all forms of toxic derivatives and other financial fictions cancelled. And anything less than what has been prescribed by LaRouche must be classified as clinically insane and dangerous. For more, stay tuned to Alpac TV for LaRouche's March 21st webcast, live at 1 p.m. Eastern Time.